As companies increasingly turn to artificial intelligence to drive revenue growth, the challenge lies not just in adopting innovative technologies, but in seamlessly integrating them into reliable production processes. Statistics reveal that while 84% of organizations believe that AI will provide them with a competitive advantage, only 20% have successfully scaled their AI initiatives to drive significant business outcome. To me, this gap underscores the complexity B2B businesses face, which include things like data silos, the lack of skilled talent, the difficulty of aligning AI projects with strategic business goals, amongst other things. So I'll be exploring how businesses can navigate these challenges, harnessing AI not just as a tool for innovation, but as a catalyst for predictable revenue growth with the CEO of Jozu. But first, hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutword.com. I'm Vinay Koshy and our guest is Brad Micklea. Brad, you're the founder and CEO of Jozu, which I believe is an MLOps collaboration platform to unite AI, ML, and app development teams with shared tools and processes. You're also the project lead for the open source kitops.ml project, which is a tool set designed to increase the speed and safety of building, testing, and managing AI, ML, and models in production. Now, Josue, I believe, is your second startup, and the first being CodeNB, which you sold to Red Hat in 2017. And your 25 plus year career in developing tools, DevOps software market, you've held a variety of positions, including that of GM for Amazon's API gateway, and built the first open and closed source products that have been leaders in Gartner's Magic Quadrants as well. I'm curious, Brad, given your career to date and certainly the inception of Jozu, was there perhaps a particular event or incident that triggered this journey into creating Jozu to what it is today?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on the show, Vinay. So yes, there was. Jozu is actually a post pivot of what the original Jozu started out as. So originally, we were focused on building out a set of kind of analytics for companies that wanted to look at their API usage from more of a productization perspective, not so much from a kind of feeds and speeds operational perspective. And to do that, what we were using was a set of correlative and predictive ML models to process the huge amount of API traffic that large kind of public APIs see. Those models would help us find correlations, patterns, both for the kind of API at large, but then also for individual organizations or users of that API. As we were doing that, what we found was that certainly for ML models, whether they're regular ML models, I'm not sure what the right term is. It sounds strange to call them traditional ML models at this stage, or LLMs, it was really tricky to get them from a Jupyter notebook or from a dev tool like MLflow or Weights and Biases into production. But then more importantly, when something would go wrong in production, because ultimately anything you put in production will eventually go wrong, rolling back, figuring out how to quickly deploy, how to adapt to that operational issue was very challenging and very not fun. And so after that happened a couple times, one of my co-founders, the CTO, and I looked at each other and said, this is crazy. It's 2023, but the tooling and the processes around handling these ML workflows, it feels like we're going back to DevOps in 2003. Mm-hmm. Which neither of us particularly wanted to do. And so we tried a bunch of different MLOps tools. We tried DevOps tools. We tried some GitOps workflows, and none of them seemed to make it materially better. And so at that point, we sat down and said, hey, maybe this is really what we should be doing. Maybe this is the right, bigger problem.
Right. I'd love to dive into that in a bit, but given your journey to date, what would you say is your personal area of strength?
So I think one of the things that has helped me a lot in my career is I have an unusual background. So I was about 8 years old when my father bought an Apple II computer for the family, and I began programming BASIC on it. One of the other things I started to do, because I was really curious how it worked, so I took the top off and I started just pulling wires out and then turning it back on and seeing what happened, and then putting the wires back in different places and seeing what happened, and just kept on doing that, which my dad didn't find very exciting, but I really enjoyed. And so I did a bunch of that kind of stuff and got really deep into computers at a very young age. But then by the time I got to the end of high school and it was time to choose a major, all my friends who we'd all been doing this together, they all went computer science, electrical engineering, computer science kind of deal. And I said, I'm going to do English. And I'll never forget my best friend's parents sat down at dinner when I told them that. They're like, you're not going to have a job. You need to do something to get a job. It was just like a shocking moment for them where they're like, why are you doing this? But strangely, I feel like having focused on English and philosophy and things like that kind of arts side through university, and then coming back to technology afterwards, has given me a really different or unnatural perspective, perhaps, from just someone who has stayed permanently in kind of computer science. And that perspective has allowed me to do two things, I think. One is that it's made it, I think, a little easier sometimes for me to spot things that provide user value different from things which are technically very impressive. Because not all technically impressive things provide a great deal of user value, and so things aren't connected. The second is that I think it has allowed me in some cases to be able to explain complex technology in simpler terms, more appropriate for folks who are not as technically deep. And as you, whether it's in a startup or a huge company like AWS, being able to do that for people can often be the difference between them feeling nervous or alienated by the technology and comfortable and excited about a technology. And that can help both in terms of selling, but also in supporting them as they pick.
Very interesting. I'd like to unpack that a little bit more by asking you a question this way. In that area of strength, what is it that you believe businesses don't know but should?
Bucket. So let me zero in a little bit. I've spent a lot of my career in product management. And one of the things that it took me a long time to really get, but whenever I've had product management teams since then, I've tried to drill it into them, is a feature is the most expensive, slowest way to solve any problem. And so if you have a set of users with a problem, it's very common for product managers and engineers to look at that and say, oh, we can fix it in code this way. And I think that the part that a lot of companies miss is that while it's critical to continue to release features, and while it is absolutely beneficial to do that faster than your competitor, choosing which things you turn into features and which things you solve through other means, changes in marketing, changes in support, changes in enablement or education, changes in sales approach, all these other levers that you have, is actually, to me, the difference between an okay company and a great company. When you look at companies that execute extremely well, like AWS, not everything becomes a feature, and not every product that they or service that they offer is as feature rich. In fact, I would argue that many AWS services that are extremely successful are among the least feature rich within their markets. And I'll just say API Gateway was absolutely one of those. It did not have as many features as many of the things we competed with. But we won a ton of deals because we focused on operational solidity, on extreme security, and being really easily absorbed in some ways into people's natural workflow with the rest of the AWS services. Those are really huge benefits for the user that have nothing to do with features.
Would you say that your ability to do that has really been part of your go-to-market processes and understanding of customers?
Yeah, I think so. I think and I always look for this in everybody in my teams. I want people who are curious about what customers are doing, who genuinely care about that customer's success, not just their success. Because I do think that is ultimately, and this is not some unique insight that I've had. I think everybody knows this. It can be hard in the moment sometimes to act on it, to say, I'm going to not do the thing which would be best for me, because I can do something different that is going to be best for the user. That I think especially that becomes a bigger challenge when you're looking at but trying to balance an open source project and a commercial offering. I think sometimes the line between those two things is often in tension, and it's difficult sometimes to make choices of moving things into the open source, knowing that you could maybe charge for them, but are you going to get enough money? Do you get more adoption and flow through by moving it over there? These are some of the challenges I think people find difficult. But if you have that hat on of always thinking, what is going to bring the greatest success to the end user, sometimes that helps clarify.
Going back to when you were trying to deal with the issues that led to Jozu, would it be fair to say that as you discovered this problem for yourselves, as part of your go-to-market research, you were finding that others were also sharing the same point in that existing tools weren't just cutting it in terms of being able to allow for that level of integration that you were seeking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things specifically that we landed on, or one of the things that bothered us, and it bothers a lot of people, I think, is that the majority of these MLOps and ML dev tools have a very proprietary way of packaging artifacts, storing artifacts, versioning artifacts, handling artifacts. And this is a bit frustrating because we've had 20 years of software engineering, more than that, time to establish standards, open standards, widely accepted standards. And while AI/ML is different in a lot of ways, I don't think it's logical to start by assuming that all the tooling and all the processes need to be different. I think you should start from a place of saying, let's assume that most of this we can work off of what we learned as software engineers and adapt it to AI/ML. So when we began looking at this problem, one of the things, like I said, we saw was that, hey, if you're using ML flow, everything gets saved in a certain format in a certain way. And if you move to weights and biases, it's all different. If you move to Domino, it's all different. And if you used a data EQ, it's all different. And that's frustrating. We spoke to other customers who had moved from one platform to another and experienced that massive retooling cost and retraining cost. And it was frustrating for them. And you compare that to the microservices world where the container is a container. And anything that handles containers, you can take that same container and use multiple different tools. So the tool handoffs become much easier. And so when we looked at this problem, we said, let's start by trying to create an open standard or leverage an open standard. And as it turned out, we didn't need to create an open standard. There already was one in the OCI specification, which is the specification that underlies containers. And so that's really what we started off saying, let's use that. And then if you're going to build something to an open standard, it makes sense to build it as an open source project. And that's how KitOps was born.
Certainly. Jozu in some way connected to KitOps?
It is essentially, so not really directly. What it is that KitOps, the whole point of KitOps is to take these disparate artifacts and save them in a single, totally secure, signable, operational artifact that now can be taken. You can run it through your deployment pipelines. You can do regulatory compliance with it, all those kinds of things that you need on the production side. That artifact is called a model kit. Jozu really revolves around all the operational tooling you'll need to do everything you would want with those model kits. So that's really its connection to KitOps. It's not an open core in the same way that like a GitLab is, where you have a GitLab free community edition, then you have the paid edition. It's not quite like that. It's more just that we take that artifact as the start point, and then these are all the things, all the actions you would want to perform with that artifact.
Right. And how does Jozu's platform facilitate the transition from AI prototypes to production-ready systems? Could you give us a bit of an understanding of that?
Yeah, great question. So the way typically that our users use, and let's talk first about KitOps, and then that'll explain the Jozu. So the way they use those KitOps model kits is as a kind of gate between development and production. Jupyter Notebooks, MLflow, weights and biases, these are wonderful tools for the development arena. And they're extremely flexible. They're very powerful for data scientists to build out the experiments as they train models, as they tune models, as they develop those models. But when it comes to production, you want as few moving parts as possible because every moving part is something that can break. And so asking those SREs, those DevOps engineers, to continue to know the tools that they've always used, but now use a completely set of different pipeline tools, a completely different set of artifacts, a completely different set of repositories to learn how to navigate an ML flow or a weights and biases. That's really hard. That's really begging for failure during an operational incident. Mm-hmm. So where you might have 30 experiments in a weights and biases for your model, maybe only 2 of those go to production. Those are the 2 that you would package with KitOps as a model kit. Then you would use Jozu to deploy those, to do diffs against them, to do rollbacks, to sign them, to run a regulatory report or turn them into what's called a secure bill of materials. So you can basically say, hey, yes, I know where every piece of this came from. I know where every part of it is going. So that's really again, that action side is Jozu. The artifact that acts as that gate is KitOps.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What would be some of the risks of not properly connecting the worlds of data science experimentation and production reliability?
Yeah, so we'll take kind of one from maybe either side. So I was speaking to one of our users, and they described a situation in which their role was testing. And so they had gotten a new model version from the data science team, and they said, great, got the model. Is there a data set that we can use to validate this that is not the training data set, obviously? And the data scientist said, yeah, the data sets are all kept over there on that S3 bucket. Awesome. So they go to that S3 bucket, they grab a data set that had the word validation in it, and it takes several days to fully test this model. It was quite a complex model. At the end of those days, they go back to the data science team and go, we have a problem. This thing failed a ton of these tests. I don't know what happened, but this is not good. And the data scientist looked at it for about 2 minutes and said, yeah, you used the wrong data set. That's the validation data set for a totally different model. You should have been using this validation data set. Super obvious to the data scientist, not obvious at all to the tester. So if there had been a model kit, the nice thing about the model kit is that it actually allows you to put the model in plus the data set, plus the embeddings, plus the LoRa adapter, all those things you need in one place. So now you just grab that model kit, and now you've got the right validation data set. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to go poking around. You don't have to worry about somebody having changed the validation data set for perfectly good reasons, but before you had a chance to test with it, all these things. On the production side, similarly, you can imagine a scenario in which a new version of the project is completed, but where the model itself didn't change. Instead, the adapters changed for it. Now, if you don't know that as an operator, and you might not know that, you might just know that there's a new version. And so you might roll back to an older version if there's a problem. That older version, if it's actually using the exact same model, is not going to help your cause. It's going to have the same failures. And so, again, you need to have these things tied together because models, data sets, and code in AI projects are not loosely coupled. They're very tightly coupled. And so while there are reasons for them being separately housed and separately versioned in the dev world, you don't want that when it comes to production.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I'd like to go to something that you mentioned earlier on, which is your desire to have people on your team that like to be close to the customer. Why do you believe that decentralizing AI expertise closer to the customer is more effective than centralizing it?
I think those are actually, Vinay, 2 different questions. I think that whether you centralize or decentralize, you can be close to the customer in both those scenarios. It's certainly, I think, more natural, perhaps is the right word, in a more decentralized organization for people to be close to the customer. But you can do it from centralized as well. I think that's more of a cultural approach, whether you're going to be highly customer focused or whether you're competitor focused, whether you're externally focused or whether you're internally focused. And these tend to be aspects of the culture. The centralization and decentralization is a really tough question. I do have an opinion, but I think it depends very much on the nuances of the organization. When I was at Red Hat and running the dev and businesses for Red Hat, I had a couple data scientists on my team. Now, at the time, this was 2017, there were a few data scientists sprinkled throughout Red Hat, but there wasn't really like a central organized data science group. That would come shortly after, but didn't exist at that time. And as a result, the two data scientists I had, they were in a team of almost 200 general engineers. It didn't really make sense for me to say, we've got engineering meetings and we've got a data science meeting with two people. And so the data scientists tend to just be part of the engineering meetings. And in hindsight, I think that was incredibly valuable because it did two things at the same time. It made the data scientists very aware of the challenges that the engineering team, the product managers, the product marketers were facing. And they were great data scientists. And so they would look at these problems and sometimes see a different kind of solution or a way that they could gather data that would help inform the decision better than the data we had. And now it was fantastic. They really had some great impact in that way. But the other kind of less obvious impact is that by talking about what they were doing and sharing their thoughts and what they were working on with their models, it opened up the engineers' minds and the product managers' minds to a different way of solving problems. I talked earlier about the fact that it's not always just build a feature. And so then there would be times when I'd be sitting with just engineers in a room chatting about some challenge, and somebody would say, I wonder if we could do this with models and help us get to the right place. And that was fantastic because that was not necessarily something I would have thought of at the time. And certainly if they'd never been exposed to it, I don't think it's something they would have thought of at the time either. So I think you have that. Plus, then, of course, by being part of some of these engineering meetings, they'd be part of some of the customer meetings. And that would further inform what they were doing, where they were going.
How have you seen decentralized AI teams drive more rapid and relevant innovations compared to, say, centralized AI teams?
Yeah, I think it depends. So the centralized AI team, I think, has some very real benefits. I think of it, if you want to parallel that's slightly more familiar maybe to folks, is it's a bit similar to the way you have platform engineering separate from having DevOps people within a particular product area. Or you might have a kind of centralized corporate marketing division working in tandem with product marketing or field marketing. So I think if you have that balance and you can get that balance right, you get the best of both worlds. The central one can help remove hurdles that lots of separate teams will feel in a much more efficient way than having all of them solve that separately. But one of the things I really appreciated about working at AWS was their idea that the best people to understand the solution to a problem are the people who are closest to the problem. And that tends to be at that edge. And it makes sense. It's intuitive, but it's something that a lot of people forget because it's much more efficient to solve the problem centrally. One of the things that I've always reiterated to my teams is you have to look for the most effective solution first, and then look to make it efficient. But if you start with the most efficient solution, it's probably not the most effective. And so you got that balance. And if you find the right balance between those two teams, your central team can be focused on efficiency and your edge teams can be focused on effectiveness. And as long as they respect each other and work well together, then you can get the best of both worlds. It's sometimes hard to get them to respect each other and work well together, though. It's easy for them to see themselves as competitive to each other.
Would you say that it's more of a mindset thing or a culture thing or a combination of the two?
I think it's both. Yeah, it's definitely, there is absolutely a cultural aspect to it. I think if the leaders of those two areas look at each other as peers and collaborators and being on the same team, and how do we share, and I respect your opinion, you respect my opinion, and we respectfully disagree, and we respectfully come to the best conclusion for the users and the company, then it can all work great. But that requires both individual mindsets to be aligned to the kind of best for
Mhm.
team, best for user, and it requires a culture that rewards that, honestly. Because if you have a culture that just rewards this person reached their goals and you didn't, therefore you stink and they're awesome and I'm going to give all the money to them and none to you, you're going to create that competitiveness. And a certain amount of competitiveness is helpful, but you don't want to overdo it.
Hmm.
So it's tricky. It is tricky.
And culture's one of those hard things to flesh out and communicate across teams. What is your perspective on ensuring that you have a cohesive and yet uh, cohesive culture that is prevalent right across the board?
So I think that, like with most things, I think you have to be explicit about
Mm.
it. I think you have to be repetitive about it. And I think you need a feedback loop. So documenting what you want your culture to be is super important. But I think where a lot of people go wrong is they document the culture that they would idealize, but not one that they are able to live up to or willing
Mhm.
to live up to. And I think if you have to be very realistic about what it is that you're going to be willing to do and sacrifice day in, day
Mhm.
out for your culture, and then document that. And over time, yes, you can modify it and improve it. But if you start with, we want to be over here, but we're really only willing to do the work to be here, then the culture is going to
Mhm.
fail because people are going to see that gap and say, this is a lie. And so I'll just do whatever I want. The other part that I think is critical is you really have to have something that you have a feedback loop on. So I think one of the things that Red Hat did a fantastic job of was making openness a core part of their culture. And they understood that the trade-off of that was we get all the benefit of open source community, but it means that we can't dictate to open source communities the way a closed source company can just dictate to its engineers and say, you're going to do this because I said you're going to do this and I employ you. So if you don't want to get fired, go do
Mhm.
it. You can't do that with open source. And so they understood that they're going to have a challenge always in terms of not being able to be dictatorial, but a benefit in terms of reaping the benefits of this massive community. And so they built a culture that would always help people err on that side of let's feed the community and give up dictatorial power. And I think that's the way you have to build that culture, is recognize the pros and the
Mhm.
cons and be comfortable with the fact that you're going to accept, pardon me, those cons repeatedly.
Mhm. Right. You talked about the complexities of AI projects going just beyond models. How would you suggest companies approach managing these complexities?
It's all the way through the life cycle. Thankfully, most people seem to be pretty aware now that one of the most critical aspects to success in AI projects is the
Mhm.
data, and really having a good grasp and understanding of what the state of data is within the organization. So I think that's incredibly valuable. But I think beyond that, there is a bit of a reckoning coming, because most organizations have really been in a develop, prototype, playground mode
Mm.
with AI ML. And production operations is a much harsher world. And so I think organizations should be thinking now, if they haven't already been, about what is the process, what is the tooling, how do we eliminate risk from production, which doesn't mean don't do
Mhm.
ML. It means figure out how to do it safely. And that's really obviously what Jozu is focused on helping.
When it comes to risk mitigation, beyond having a platform like Jozu, are there other considerations that we need to keep in mind?
Absolutely. And I think most of them are the same kind of considerations, or at least similar to what you saw in standard software. You need to be thinking about security from the get go. That was one of the things I certainly learned from API Gateway, because as you can imagine, it is the front door for Amazon. It's almost always under attack. And it's down to the professionalism of the teams there that you would never know that as a customer, because they put so much effort into protecting that service and all the services that are there. The same thought needs to go in here. I think if you're in the EU, for example, with the recently passed EU AI Act, you have a lot to consider about regulation and compliance. In some cases, the models that you're training, you'll need to show the exact state of data that trained that model for up to 10 years after that model was trained. That requires real thought. You can't just say, I guess we'll tell the database group to give us a slice of the database from 10 years ago. That's not going to work. You're going to have some other process in place. So I think just working through all those kinds of scenarios and saying, how are we going to do a rollback? What are we going to do if there's a 0-day vulnerability? How do we temporarily turn off the model if we need to temporarily turn off the model? Having all those things in advance and thinking through them and saying, are we ready? Are we ready? Are we ready? Are we ready? It's not like it's straightforward, but I think it's work that a lot of times people neglect because it's not necessarily fun until you're in the moment. And in the moment is not when you really want to be trying to figure out how to do this stuff, especially because AI projects have such a high executive visibility right now.
Would you say that that a checklist type approach should suffice in most cases, or is there an element of culture that really needs to be fleshed out as well?
No, it's 100%. You need a culture like this. It needs to be baked into how people think. Checklists checklists are like a rear view mirror. You would never drive a car looking only in the rearview mirror, but a checklist is almost always built exclusively from, this is what blew up last time. This is what blew up last time. This is what blew up last time. And they're important. You need to make sure that once something does break, you don't let it ever break again. But that's not enough. You have to be always looking through the lens of, is there a way that this could make us non-compliant? Is there a way that this could make us insecure? Is there a way that this could make us operationally ineffective? Is this a way that customers could get hurt? If you're not constantly going through those things as you talk about every change, you're going to miss stuff. And even when you do, you're still going to miss stuff, but you're going to miss way less stuff. And you're going to be much more prepared when you do miss something to address it rapidly and effectively.
I have heard in some circles that using open source tools for things including AI is a bit of a no. So I'm curious to get your take on what are some of the misconceptions about using open source tools for AI in a corporate setting, and how can they be addressed?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I'll be open and transparent about the fact that I've worked with open source for a very long time, most of my career. So there may be some bias here. I think everybody has some amount of bias. It's just important for us to talk about it openly. I think the exact opposite is really true. I think it's much more dangerous for an enterprise to not be able to understand what is under the hood of what they are using and relying on than the risk around open source. And I understand, especially recently, there was the famous incident recently with open source and everyone freaked out. I think the reality is, you compare that to what happened with CrowdStrike, you still don't really know what happened there. And it is not entirely clear what that kind of root cause was and whether the changes that have been necessary to be made have been made. In the open source, it is different. It is open. As long as you put the time in, you can go and see exactly what broke. And you can look at exactly what has been done about it. And so it puts a little bit more onus on you to do some homework. But ultimately, there are far more eyes on most large open source projects than there are on proprietary projects. So to me, that's point number one. Point number two is, within most businesses, what you don't want to be doing is putting your effort into something that is now going to directly help your competitor. But when you are working with a non-open source AI vendor, whether it's OpenAI or Google or whatever, your data, your prompts, your questions and responses are training that model, which is the same model that is used by your competitor. So all the effort you're putting in is helping you, yes, but it is also helping your competitor. I think there are definitely certain industries where you should be very wary of doing that, and where it would be much better off for you to take a model that you can train privately, and you can hold on to all the benefits that you get from training that model on your corpus of data and not risk having that leak into helping your competitors' data. So to me, open source models just make much more sense in the long term. Especially like today, there is a gap between an open AI and some of the open source models. That gap keeps getting smaller and smaller as every few months, every year progresses. And at some point, honestly, these AIs are going to get powerful enough where for most people, an 80% powerful AI will be more than what they need. And they don't really need that extra 20% that they may even get from somebody.
Right. Ultimately, we want to ensure that whatever we're producing aligns with business goals. So I'm curious, what strategies have you found to be most effective in ensuring that AI development aligns with and supports broader business objectives?
I think some of it is about being explicit about what those business objectives are. I think exposing those teams directly to, and so, for example, when I speak to users, it's overwhelming for them to get everybody in the company on the call with them. They'd feel uncomfortable. But I will ask if I can record it, and I will record those. And the engineering team watches them. They watch them carefully because they care. And that gives them so much more direct education about where our users are happy, where they're frustrated, where they're nervous. And that can inform what they're going to do. That's hugely important. But I think as well, with AI, one of the tricky things is that AIs are not deterministic in the same way that computer programs algorithms have been deterministic. Super deterministic things are very well suited to quantifiable goals because you put the same input in here and you get the same output there. You can easily measure that. AIs are trickier. It isn't as easy. It's more like human beings. It's not quite as simple to give a quantifiable measure about whether I am doing a good job versus somebody else. There's a lot of intangibles that go into that too. And I think that one of the things that we're all figuring out, and I don't have the answer, is what are those intangibles and how do we roll those into the goals for the AI? For example, I was at a think tank in Boston on Tuesday, and one of the big topics that came out was you have accuracy, which is very easily measured in a model, but then you have transparency or explainability, which is much harder to quantifiably measure, but you can look at it, you can evaluate it. And then it got into the question of to what degree does it matter for different models to be explainable? For example, if I'm asking a model to evaluate my financials, does it bother me if it gets them right all the time? Does it bother me that I can't ask it how it got to that answer? Maybe not. If I'm using a model, though, to prioritize which people will be interviewed for a job or which people will be prioritized for an MRI in a hospital when there's a big backlog, do I want to be able to ask how it came up with that sequence and that prioritization? I think I absolutely do. I think it's very important at that point to be able to make sure that there isn't bias built into that model. And if I can't get any explanation out of the model, should I be using it? I think there's a very real argument to say, no, you shouldn't. You could end up doing more harm than good. But it's tricky because it's not like it's 70% biased. This one's only 30% biased. Like you can't quite do it that way. And I think that's where there's going to be companies are going to have to get comfortable with that more qualitative assessment and figure out how do they want to roll that in.
Very interesting. Which brings to mind the idea that AI adoption often requires cultural shifts within an organization. What strategies do you recommend for navigating these changes while keeping business on track?
So I think that the way I've approached cultural changes is you need to be very direct. You need to be very unequivocal and clear up front about how things have been and how things will need to be and how you will get together from point A to point B. Then you just need to have a constant cadence of evaluating, rewarding things that move in that path, and course correcting things that are not moving in that path. And it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, a lot of dedication. Changing culture is probably the hardest and most kind of long duration type project that you can undertake at a business. But in many cases, it will have some of the biggest impacts ongoing to a business. And you can see that both there's negative examples and positive examples out there. So I think that's the most critical thing is people just need to be reminded during culture shifts over and over again. And they need tangible examples. Hey, Angela did an amazing job because look, when she was given this choice, she chose this thing over that thing. And that is clearly reflective of where we want to be, not where we were. Way to go, Angela. You did a great job. And then that gives somebody tangible feedback on, oh, okay, I get it. I get how I can now operationalize this culture change. So it's more than just repeating the cultural tenets and repeating the cultural tenets over and over again. You've got to help people through that path, through those tough choices.
Would that be a key part of the process of helping organizations balance the need for innovation along with the necessity for business stability?
I think so. Yeah, for sure. And I think that culture is a sometimes underappreciated hack towards innovation. When you look at the most innovative companies and you look at how their culture operates, you'll often see things reflective in the culture that really help drive that innovation. Again, when I was at AWS, one of the things that you saw was there really was a constant empowerment of anybody at almost any level to challenge a decision and at least ask for justification. And people would take that in the spirit of, it's good that I'm being challenged. Thank you for challenging me. Allow me to explain my logic. And there would be a healthy debate and a conclusion. And so I think things like that can be a real drive for innovation, even though it may feel at the time uncomfortable.
Thinking back to your last startup, CodeNB, were there perhaps a couple of key lessons that you picked up from your experience there that you've applied to Jozu?
Yeah. So for sure, I think one of the things that was really interesting about CodeNB is that we were using containers at scale in 2015, 2016. And it's easy to forget, but at that time, containers were a very new technology and operating them at scale was not straightforward. It was not well documented. It was not well understood. At the time, even Docker, who was probably ahead of everybody at that point with Docker Swarm, even Docker Swarm was not 3 nines stable. And so we were this little company trying to do the same thing, not quite at the scale of Docker Swarm, but at quite a significant scale. And man, we hit so many problems. And for, I would say, 9 months to a year, all of our competitors publicly effectively laughed at us and would point and go, you definitely don't want to use that service because it falls down a bunch of the time. Ha ha, aren't they silly? But once you got it figured out, and we were really convinced that containers were going to be the future, and I guess luckily we got it right. By the time we got it figured out, we had well over a year head start on all of our competitors. And once it clicked and everyone was like, where's your containers? All of our competitors were scrambling, going, well, a VM is basically a container. And people would be like, no, it's not. Show me your containers. Oh, we don't have any. And then they would come over to us and there are the containers and they can easily interact with them and they can use them. And that was such a huge tailwind for us and was a big part of why ultimately Red Hat was so keen to acquire us. It was because of that head start we had. We knew that we could transition to Kubernetes, which is their That was their kind of strategic future at Red Hat at the time. OpenShift was still quite young. And we could say with great confidence, and they could see that we would be able to transition those containers to Kubernetes much more easily than somebody who's working with VMs would be able to transition to Kubernetes. So I think that we've taken, again, it's still fairly early in the transition to ML in production. For most organizations, they're just starting that journey. And so we're again at a stage where I think some people are looking at what we're doing and saying, you don't need to do that yet. There aren't that many companies doing ML in production. But we are convinced that there will be a giant tsunami of companies that will need this type of solution. We can get a year ahead again, and that will be enormous for us when everybody wakes up and goes, oh, the tsunami's here. Where's my surfboard? Oh, we're already out there. We've already caught the wave.
Very interesting. In the space of leveraging AI for scaling revenue growth, are there perhaps a couple of areas that you find doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
In terms, sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. In terms of leveraging AI, not only to innovate, but also to scale revenue growth, are there perhaps a couple of areas that you find doesn't get much airtime or doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
I think right now it's such a hot topic in kind of the press generally that I feel like people are talking about every possible aspect of AI and a bunch that don't even honestly make a ton of sense to me. So I think it's almost the opposite problem now where there's almost too much noise.
Right.
And the trick is filtering out those things which maybe are a bit more of a head scratcher than looking for things that have not really been talked about. To me, the biggest head scratchers are when I look at products or companies that are really just fronting capabilities from an OpenAI or other kind of third-party closed source large language model. That to me, I don't really understand. I get why it exists now, but I don't understand why or how it will be valuable to people in 3 years. Similarly, I guess there is right now a lot of focus on using things like OpenAI and others through APIs, which is very easy. And it's a great way to get started and it's a great way to prove out what you're doing. But as I said earlier, I feel like in the long run, there is such a huge amount of value in taking your organization's hard-won knowledge, hard-won experience and wisdom of your customers, your vertical, your solution set, and just handing that off to a third party seems insane to me. And so I think that there aren't enough companies who are really thinking about what does that and how much am I giving up in order to get the convenience of an LLM that's already just sitting there? And is it really that much more work for me to begin tuning an off-the-shelf open source AI and turn that into my competitive advantage? And I believe that the companies that do that first and most aggressively will have the biggest advantage over their peer set in the next 5 years.
Excellent. Brad, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
So I think that the top takeaways to me would be don't discount open source models and open source approaches. I think it would be think hard about what and begin actually working through what is your operationalization, what is your production world need to look like to attain your business goals and your customers' expectations. Different customers have different levels of expectations. It's if you're in the EU, start figuring out what's in that EU AI Act because you're already in fact under its influence, and you need to figure out how that's going to impact you. And 4 would be look at your company and say, do we have the culture, the tools, the teams to be successful in AI? It isn't enough just to say, hey, everybody, start doing AI. You've got to approach it more holistically as, are we really ready to be an AI company? Or are we comfortable being just someone who uses AI? And it's okay. You can be either, but don't mistake which one you're at as you begin to embark on the journey.
Brilliant. And if listeners are curious and want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more about the open source project, which is a great place to start, you can go to kitops.ml. If you want to learn more about Jozu, you can go ahead to jozu.com. And if you'd rather just pick my brain about what you're thinking, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. I think the only Brad Micklea on LinkedIn, so it should be pretty easy. And I'm generally pretty responsive.
Okay, we'll include links to that in the show notes. Brad, thank you for doing this. It's been brilliant.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
No